I was raised in a quite traditional Seventh-day Adventist home, and if you're not very familiar with the Adventist tradition, back in the day, and I think for many Adventists still today, there's a lot of tradition associated with the Sabbath. So in my household, on Friday afternoons, my sisters and I would be compelled, usually against our will, to help Mother clean the house to get ready for Sabbath. Did any of you have that experience as a child, perhaps, growing up? All week long, wow. It wasn't quite that bad in our home, but Fridays were a time of getting ready for the Sabbath. And Friday evening, the tradition in our house was we would always welcome the Sabbath with candles and freshly baked cinnamon rolls, which my mom would always prepare on Friday afternoon. So despite the pain of preparing for the Sabbath, there was kind of a sweetness and a kind of aura about the Sabbath that made it almost mystically beautiful for me in my memories. There was another thing about the Sabbath that was sort of different from other days of the week for us, and that was on Sabbath, Friday evening to Saturday evening, we would listen to only what was referred to as Sabbath music. You've had this experience maybe growing up as a child. What was Sabbath music? Well, it couldn't be something that was, secular lyrics or something like that. For some reason, classical music was by definition Sabbath music, even though a lot of that stuff was pretty secular in origin. But in any case, there had to be a different kind of atmosphere and a different kind of rhythm to the Sabbath day. So to this day, I find it very hard to get into a car with friends, for example, on Sabbath, and they turn on some kind of rock station on the radio, and it's jarring to me. Not because I think there's something morally wrong with this, but because it just doesn't feel like Sabbath music to me. So when I get in my car, I still have a couple of CDs I keep in there that I listen to on Sabbath, my Sabbath music CDs. One of them is a group known as Chanticleer, a cappella male chorus, that has a great album of African-American spirituals. And one of my favorite songs on this album is the song, "Who Will Be a Witness?" Do any of you know this great spiritual? Who will be a witness? Well, the song talks about some of the great heroes of the Bible, of the Old Testament in particular. And it says, you read in the Bible and you understand Methuselah was the oldest man. He lived to 999. He died and went to heaven, Lord, in due time. Methuselah was a witness for my Lord. And the chorus goes like this. Methuselah was a witness for my Lord. And the next verse talks about Samson, the strongest man who ever lived on earth. Delilah fooled Samson, this we know, for the Holy Bible tells us so. She shaved off his head just as clean as your hand. His strength became just like any natural man. Samson was a witness for my Lord. Samson was a witness for my Lord. Kind of strange that Samson is a witness too, even though he failed. And the next verse talks about Daniel. Daniel was a Hebrew child. He went to pray to his God for a while. The king at once, for Daniel did send, and he put him right down in the lion's den. Does anyone know what the lion says next? God sent his angels for the lion to keep. Daniel laid down and he went to sleep. Daniel was a witness for my Lord. Daniel was a witness for my Lord. And then the song asks the question, who will be a witness for my Lord? Who will be a witness for my Lord? And it says, my soul will be a witness for my Lord. My soul will be a witness for my Lord. There's a great version of this song. If you just Google "Who Will Be a Witness" on YouTube sometime, you'll find an amazing version of this song being sung by a congregation in South Carolina somewhere, an African-American congregation, and there's no music accompanying them, no instruments accompanying them. They're simply singing, but also clapping and stomping their feet, and the entire congregation is singing this song, all the way from small children to very elderly people, and it's just an incredibly powerful thing to watch. When I see this song, I think that Marx and Nietzsche were definitely wrong about religion. Karl Marx, he said that religion was what, famously? Zane knows. The opium of the masses, or the opium of the people, kind of a narcotic to keep us from thinking about the suffering and the troubles of this world. Well, think about this song and think about what it's actually saying here. Daniel, what was the story of Daniel? Daniel defied the powers. He defied the king, the ruler, and as a result was thrown into the lion's den, and God miraculously protected him. But in this case, Daniel is not standing in for some kind of longing for heaven, right? Daniel is somebody who is being a witness in the present and experiencing danger as a result. How about Nietzsche, the great German philosopher Nietzsche? What did he have to say about religion and about Christianity in particular? He said that Christianity was a religion of resentment, concocted by the weak and the powerless to inflict guilt on the powerful. And he thought it was therefore a kind of joyless, lifeless religion. But you hear this song and there's almost like contagious kind of life-affirming joy in this song. It's almost like an anthem of defiance. I think Nietzsche and Marx both clearly never experienced African-American spirituals. They might have had a different view of religion if they had sometime attended a church like that one in South Carolina instead of the sort of insipid European, pietistic churches that they were familiar with. So all of this, by way of introduction, is to raise the question for us this morning. Who will be a witness? Who will be a witness? What does it mean to be a witness? The song, in fact, even though all of the people who figure in the song are characters from the Old Testament, the song is in fact alluding to a passage from the New Testament. Does anyone know where this passage may be found? Rack your minds. It is from the book of Hebrews, in which we have a fantastic catalog of heroes of faith. Before we get to that passage, though, which is in the bulletin, and it's from the lectionary reading for this morning, before we get there, maybe we need to give a little bit of background to this book of Hebrews so we can appreciate the reading in some kind of context. The book of Hebrews is one of the earliest books in the New Testament. It dates from around 62 to 64 AD or CE. So this is even before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. The authorship of this book is unknown. It was traditionally attributed to the Apostle Paul. However, there is really no good historical or textual evidence for that. And most scholars today reject the idea that Paul was the author of this letter. There's one fascinating theory about who wrote this book, and that is that the book was written actually by Priscilla, a woman. You can Google search it sometime if you're interested in the evidence that has been brought to that argument. In any case, regardless of who the author of this book is, it's a book that is very stylistically eloquent, theologically complex, and has all the hallmarks of being written by a brilliant teacher and great thinker of the church. There are passages in this book that are beyond me, frankly, but there's some big themes that we can at least appreciate and grasp. First of all, the book begins by unfolding a picture of Christ that reflects a very high Christology, as theologians would say. Who is the Christ of the book of Hebrews? Well, the book reads, "The Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by the power of his word." This is a picture of Christ as the cosmic creator and king of the universe. What about humanity? Where do human beings fit into this picture? By the time we arrive at chapter 2, the author of the book quotes from Psalms the verses that read, "You made them," humans that is, "a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet." But then the author goes on to problematize this passage. He says, or she says, depending on who wrote, "In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them," referring to humanity. "Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to them." Is that right? Do we not see a world that is tragically flawed in many ways, where humans are unable to control their own lives or society or work out the good? Look at what's happening in the news right now, for example, in Egypt, where violence is unfolding in a terrible way. Clearly, at the present, not everything is under human control or subject to human will. But then the author of the book continues on. So at present, we don't see everything subject to human beings or everything working out for the good. But, the author writes, we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, so who became a human, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. But one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Jesus, in some way, the book is telling us, has adopted humankind and made us part of the divine family. And so, we read, since children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. That's kind of an interesting line, I thought, as I was reading over it. Listen to that again. Held in slavery by their fear of death. What do you normally hear Christ has delivered us from? Sin, or even death itself, right? But in this case, what is being modified here or challenged is not death and not sin, but fear, right? Fear of death. Christ is the one who, by entering into this human situation, by entering into the human condition and even going so far as to die, is in some mysterious way able to free us from the fear of death. And the passage continues, he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God. That's kind of perplexing, isn't it? He had to be made like them. He had to become a human. What was it that compelled God to solve the problem of death and fear of death by becoming a human being? The kind of theology that is being presented here is sometimes referred to as Christus Victor theology. Have you heard this term before? I know you have if you've been coming to the church for a while, because there was a sermon previously preached here, actually a whole series of sermons that Ryan Bell preached on different theories of atonement, and Christus Victor was one of them. There's a kind of picture of what God is up to on the cross that is probably the dominant picture in Protestant evangelical America today, and that's known as penal substitutionary or atonement theology. I was actually just this week sitting in the computer lab at USC, where I work, and a grad student there, a friend of mine working on a PhD at USC, got to talking about religion. He was raised in a somewhat conservative Christian home, and he basically has given up on Christianity, or at least the kind of Christianity he grew up with. And he said, yeah, it just doesn't make any sense to me at all why God would want to, kill or need to kill someone or his own son or something to try to set people right. Well, that's kind of the atonement theology picture of what's going on the cross, right? You sinned as a human being. God is really, really angry at you. He has to vent his anger somewhere, right? He's got to hit something. And instead of inflicting this violence on you, Christ steps in between you and God. And so this wrathful God is appeased because his violence has been sort of redirected or rechanneled. Did you grow up with some kind of theology similar to that, or maybe exactly like that? I don't know. Not quite so vengeful. That's good. And I think that that the Adventist Church, or the Adventist tradition, has done a good job of emphasizing God's character of love. That's what this whole cosmic conflict is about, right? It's about God's character. Nevertheless, I think many Adventists continue to use this kind of language of God's wrath and the necessity of having a substitutionary death, someone stepping in and taking the death for us. In contrast to that picture, what Christus Victor theology gives us is a picture of a world, not just a world, a cosmos that is in captivity to powers and forces that are wreaking havoc, chaos, suffering, injustice, all of these terrible things. And the way that God deals with or resolves this problem is by entering into the human situation. And through his resurrection, making it possible for us to participate in his life as well. Christ has gained a victory over the principalities and the powers. And that is why we celebrate Christ's resurrection and his death. We maybe have a hard time understanding or appreciating this kind of story because we've grown up in a kind of Christian or post-Christian society and world where the story of Christ and his death is just kind of taken for granted. It's assumed, it's part of popular culture, and we can't hear the radical subversiveness of the story as it would have sounded to the people who were first introduced to it. One Christian writer who I really enjoy reading is an Eastern Orthodox theologian by the name of David Bentley Hart. He wrote a fantastic book called Atheist Delusions, and I saw an interview with him, and he was very upset about the title. Apparently, he had a different title, and the publisher put Atheist Delusions because they thought it would sell better copy. But this book is a kind of defense of Christianity against people like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, some of the popularizers of atheism in contemporary society. And he has this great chapter in this book called The Great Rebellion, where what Hart does, he's a historian as well as a theologian, he goes back and he talks about baptism in the earliest Christian church. We do baptism here in a very public way. We also do communion in a very public way. In fact, Hollywood Church practices open communion, right? Anyone who walks in the door is welcome to come forward and participate. No one checks their credentials or ask them, do you really know what you're doing here, right? In the earliest Christian church, this wasn't the case. Typically, to become a Christian, you had to first become what was known as a catechumen, a student of the church's teachings. And you could remain a catechumen sometimes for years, studying, being taught the meaning of the faith, subjecting yourself to church discipline and leadership. And during this period, when you were a catechumen in the early church, you were not allowed to partake of the communion. In fact, in many cases, you were not even allowed to watch the communion being partaken by others. You would sit in the service, you would hear the liturgy, and then at the point where communion was going to be had, those who were not baptized were ushered out of the church. What do we think of that? It doesn't fit our modern sensibilities, our spirit of openness and tolerance and inclusivity and welcoming, right? But there was a kind of deadly seriousness to this communion meal that the early church wanted to impress upon all people. Beyond that, this is a church that is, in many cases, sort of growing subversively underground in conditions of persecution or repression. So after one was finally determined to be ready for baptism, they would take the individual to a location apart from the church. Usually it was a kind of grotto, almost underground, in the dark, and ideally with a flowing stream of water. And the individual would enter the pool naked. They would be submerged into the water 3 times in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And they would emerge from the water, and a white robe would be placed on them. This was often done on Easter Eve. And they would then be brought into the church, and for the first time in their life, they would both see and partake of the communion meal. Radical stuff, huh? Does this sort of thrill you, or does it weird you out? For me, I find it kind of thrilling, to be honest, because it captures something profound here that I think we sometimes miss in our informality. Let me read to you just a little passage here from David Hart describing what all of this really signified for the early believers. He writes, "Perhaps the most crucial feature of the rite, this ritual, however, at least for understanding what baptism meant for the convert from paganism, occurred before the catechumen's descent into the font. At the bishop's direction, he or she would turn, face the west, the land of the evening, and so symbolically the realm of all darkness, cosmic and spiritual, submit to a rather forcibly phrased exorcism, and then clearly renounce, indeed revile, and quite literally spit at the devil and the devil's minions. Then he or she would turn to face the east, the land of the morning and light, to confess their total faith in and promise complete allegiance to Christ. This was by no means mere ritual spectacle. It was an actual and, so to speak, legally binding transference of fealty or loyalty from one master to another. It was, he writes, charged with a palpable quality of irreverent boldness. And then a kind of triumphant contempt. In confessing Christ, one was entrusting oneself to the invincible conqueror who had defeated death, despoiled hell of its hostages, and subdued the powers of the air, and who had been raised up the Lord of history. That's dramatic, right? Behind this whole kind of performance, if we want to call it that, or celebration, was the understanding that the principalities and powers of the pagan world were forces of tremendous cruelty and guile. That was why Christians were in fact called atheists. Did you know that? The earliest Christians were accused of being atheists. The term atheism was first applied to Christians because they held all of the gods that held society together in such contempt. They were truly seditious. So the book of Hebrews continues. It talks about the Sabbath, interestingly enough, Sabbath rest. It says, okay, so if Christ is the one who delivers us from the fear of death and gives us this kind of peace, we have, it says, the promise of entering his rest. Let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. And going on, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. But listen to the paradox here. What is being said? The promise of entering his rest. What is Christ's rest? Well, when did Christ rest? When he was in the tomb, no? So there is a kind of double meaning, I think, going on here, paradoxically. We enter Christ's rest by entering his death. And Sabbath, in Christian perspective, is this kind of liminal space, this interval space between Christ's death and his resurrection. We are resting with Christ in his death in the hope of being raised to new life in the future. This is, anyways, the kind of picture that's going on in the book of Hebrews, cosmic redemption, right? And the book then exhorts us to be faithful and persevere in running the good race. And at this point, I've asked a friend of mine who's visiting today, Zane Yi, if he could read for us the lectionary reading, which is basically picking up in the middle of a long reckoning of faithful witnesses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses, and we continue this story of people of faith with the reading.
Our scripture is taken from the Epistle to the Hebrews, chapter 11, verse 29, through chapter 12, verse 2.
Yeah, and it's in your bulletin, by the way.
By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land. And the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel, and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so they might obtain a better resurrection. And others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted. They were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins, in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, men of whom the world was not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And all these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised, because God had provided something better for us, so that apart from us they would not be made perfect. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The word of the Lord.
So the question we are left with this morning is, what are the things that are holding us captive to fear today? What are the principalities and powers in our own lives? And there are certainly many ones we might name. We can name social ones: racism, nationalism, sexism, all of these kinds of things that in different ways bind people. We can name individual ones, right? Addictions and dysfunctionalities that many of us struggle with. And we can ask the question, how then can we be faithful witnesses as individuals and as a community to the risen Christ in the spirit of this book of Hebrews? I would suggest here that one of the ways we can do that is by what Bill Salvador wrote about in his reflections here that you can also read in your bulletin, where he talks about a church committed to social justice. There's another hymn I was listening to actually last Sabbath as I was leaving the church. I had this other CD in my car. Do any of you know who Jesse Norman is? Great soprano singer. Well, she was, this is doubly strange, I suppose. I was not only listening to old hymns in my car, I was also listening to Christmas music. So she was singing the song, "O Holy Night," and I was listening to the lyrics, and I was suddenly struck by what was being said in the song, because it's actually quite different and more radical than I've ever thought it to be. The song was composed actually by a French Catholic commissioner of wine, Placide Cappeau, I hope I'm saying that right, in 1841. He wrote the words and then asked his friend, Adolphe Charles Adams, who was a Jewish composer, to write the music. So this is interesting already, right? Original lyrics by a Catholic wine commissioner, music by a Jewish composer, and the English version, the words you're most familiar with, were by a man by the name of John Sullivan Dwight, who was a Unitarian minister and a radical abolitionist. Listen carefully to the words in the light of today's reflections on the meaning of Christ's life and death. O holy night, the stars are brightly shining. It is the night of the dear Savior's birth. Long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the Spirit felt its worth. Human beings discovering their true humanity. A thrill of hope and the weary world rejoices. And you know the rest of that verse, I'm sure, by heart. But maybe you're less familiar with the final stanza of the song, O Holy Night. And this is what it reads. Truly, he taught us to love one another. His law is love and his gospel is peace. Chains he shall break, for the slave is our brother. And in his name all oppression shall cease. This is a song about emancipation. It's a song about liberation, right? And in fact, this song for a long time was banned in France because of its radicalness, and also because of the fact that the music was written by a Jewish composer. So, again, the question, who will be a witness? Who will be a witness for my Lord? How can we be more faithful witnesses to the risen Christ in our contemporary world? How can we be individuals and a community that speaks this kind of meaning into a society that has grown tired of hearing the story in many cases, or maybe never heard the story correctly to begin with? We have a closing song now that I think connects well with this theology. This wasn't planned. I didn't ask for this song to be played, but I hope as we sing together in Christ alone, that you will listen carefully to the words and perhaps sing them with new meaning for yourself in your own life. Thank you.